An infinite horizon unfolds, where the sky merges with a vast expanse of grass covering what we now know as the plains of Texas and New Mexico. This seemingly motionless and eternal landscape bore witness to a fierce war that changed the course of history. Here, the Apache and the Comanche fought with an intensity that would define their destinies forever. The story begins in the 16th century when the Apache had established their dominance in the southern plains, in regions that now include parts of western Texas and eastern New Mexico. They were expert bison hunters and resilient farmers, living in perfect harmony with the land. But balance never lasts. Far to the east, in the Rocky Mountains, in what is now Colorado, a marginalized tribe struggled to survive. The Comanche, driven out by more powerful enemies, had been pushed into arid and unproductive lands. Scarcity hardened them. Adversity made them aggressive. For them, every day was a battle for survival, and each struggle fueled an unrelenting grudge against the Apache, who controlled the best territories. Then, the Spanish arrived. In the 1500s, conquistadors, armed with steel and horses, swept through Mexico. Their advance northward brought them to the heart of Apacheria, where they met fierce resistance. The Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare, quickly adopted the use of horses stolen from Spanish settlements. Within decades, they became expert riders, capable of launching swift and devastating raids against the settlers. Unknowingly, the Apache had unleashed a weapon that would transform the landscape. The Spanish horses spread across the plains, falling into the hands of the Comanche. For these outcasts, horses were not just a means of transportation, they were the key to domination. Within a few years, the Comanche had developed unmatched skill in mounted combat. They learned to breed horses, something no other native group had done, and their mobility became their greatest weapon. By the mid-17th century, the plains began to change. The Comanche, mounted on their Mustang horses, began a meteoric rise. The Apache, who had ruled for generations, found themselves facing an enemy they had not foreseen. The war was not just about honor or territory. It was a struggle for survival itself. In this context, Apache raids against Spanish settlements intensified. Places like Santa Fe and Taos, in what is now New Mexico, were attacked with relentless violence. Spanish settlers, unable to defend themselves effectively, sought refuge behind walls and prayed for salvation. However, each Apache victory also planted the seeds of their downfall. The horses they stole and inadvertently released only strengthened their future executioners. By the end of the 17th century, the first direct encounters between the Apache and the Comanche marked the beginning of a war that would last for decades. These initial skirmishes, though small, made it clear that the balance of power was shifting. Under the darkness of night, under the full moon, known as the Comanche Moon, Comanche riders launched devastating attacks. Their ability to move quickly, strike with precision, and disappear before reinforcements arrived became legendary. The Apache tried to resist, relying on their skill in fighting on foot and their deep knowledge of the terrain. But the speed of the Comanche constantly outmatched them. Each lost battle pushed the Apache further from the plains and into the mountains, where horses were less effective. Thus, what had begun as a territorial conflict evolved into a war of extermination. The first great Apache tragedy occurred in 1723 when the Comanche launched a massive attack known as the Great Siege of Ferrero, near what is now western Texas. For several days, the Comanche besieged the Lipan Apache, killing their warriors and capturing women and children for the slave trade. It was a devastating defeat that marked the beginning of the end for the Apache in the plains. Meanwhile, the Spanish watched from a distance, unable to intervene and increasingly concerned about the growing power of the Comanche. But the Apache, though wounded, were not ready to surrender. Their history, marked by resilience and adaptation, was far from over. At the beginning of the 18th century, the plains encompassing what we now know as central Texas and northern New Mexico had become a theater of war. The Comanche, now masters of mounted combat, carried out raids that were not mere acts of plunder. These were strategic campaigns, meticulously planned, combining speed, brutality, and fearsome coordination. The Apache, on the other hand, faced an enemy more organized and mobile than ever before. While the Lipan, Mescalero, and Jicarilla Apache bands struggled to hold their ground, the power of the Comanche began to overshadow them. This period marked the beginning of a new era, the rise of the Comanche as the riders of terror. The Comanche raids knew no clear borders. From the vast southern plains to the valleys of the Pecos River, no place was safe. They attacked under the cover of darkness, taking advantage of the full moon, a phenomenon Spanish settlers would later call the Comanche Moon, to move swiftly and lethally. During the spring and summer, when the grass was plentiful to feed their horses, Comanche launched their most devastating attacks. In 1758, a particularly significant event marked this period of terror. The Apache, aware of their disadvantage, attempted to manipulate the Spanish into acting as a buffer between them and the Comanche. They convinced the colonists to build a mission and a presidio in San Saba, in what is now central Texas, under the promise of peace and conversion to Christianity. However, the Spanish did not realize that this region was deep within Comanche territory. When the Comanche discovered the Spanish presence on their land, they saw it as a direct provocation. In the spring of that year, a Comanche army, accompanied by allied tribes, attacked the San Saba mission. It was a massacre. The buildings were burned, and both soldiers and missionaries were slaughtered. This attack, known as the Massacre of San Saba, underscored the Comanche's determination to maintain control over their territory and sent a clear message to the settlers. For the Spanish, this event was a brutal reminder of the ferocity of the Comanche. For the Apache, it was an equally brutal reminder that their strategy had failed. And for the Comanche, it solidified their reputation as the most formidable warriors of the plains. However, the conflict was far from over. With each battle, tensions in the region continued to escalate, as the Apache sought new forms of resistance and the Spanish struggled to maintain control in an increasingly chaotic environment.
Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and leave me your comment. Your support helps us keep growing to bring you more stories like this one. Thank you very much.
By the late 18th century, the territories that now encompass southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, and western Texas had become a constant battlefield between the Apache, the Comanche, and Spanish settlers. The conflict had reached a crisis point, and the Spanish were facing pressure from all sides. The Comanche, now a consolidated military power, launched devastating raids not only against the Apache but also against Spanish settlements. In this context, the Spanish, unable to control both tribes through force, devised a bold strategy, negotiating a truce with the Comanche. In 1786, under the leadership of the governor of New Mexico, Juan Bautista de Anza, a historic meeting was arranged in Taos. This agreement offered trade and a truce with the Comanche in exchange for their assistance in fighting the Apache. The pact was an immediate success for the Spanish. The Comanche, driven by their historic hatred of the Apache and the benefits of trade with the settlers, honored their side of the deal. In January 1790, a coalition of Spanish troops and Comanche warriors launched a massive attack against the Lipan Apache in a canyon near present-day San Antonio, Texas. The battle was a massacre. The Apache suffered heavy casualties, and the survivors were forced to flee into the mountains. For the Comanche, this alliance provided access to Spanish goods, including weapons and additional horses, further strengthening their dominance over the plains. For the Spanish, it temporarily reduced Comanche raids on their territories. However, for the Apache, It was a devastating blow that pushed them even further to the edge of survival. Despite these losses, the Apache continued to resist. Their deep knowledge of the mountainous terrain and their ability to adapt allowed them to wage a guerrilla war against both the Comanche and the Spanish. In the following decades, the Apache would prove time and again their resilience, surviving even under the harshest conditions. The alliance between the Spanish and the Comanche marked a turning point in the conflict, but it also underscored the fragility of relationships based on temporary interests. As the 18th century came to an end, the balance of power in the region continued to shift. The arrival of new colonial powers and the westward expansion of the United States would add a new layer of complexity to this never-ending war. As the 19th century progressed, the Apache had retreated into the mountains and deserts, in territories that now encompass parts of present-day Arizona, northern Mexico, and the southwestern United States. Although they had been displaced from the plains, they had not lost their ability to fight. On the contrary, in the mountains, they found a natural sanctuary from which to continue their resistance. Apache tactics adapted to their new environment. Masters of every canyon, mountain pass, and cave, they launched swift raids against Comanche camps and settler outposts. These attacks, though small, were devastating and kept their struggle alive. For the Comanche, who were accustomed to open combat on the plains, the mountainous terrain presented a different challenge, one where their advantage on horseback was far less effective. The pressure on the Apache also came from American settlers, whose westward expansion further disrupted the balance of power in the region. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and Mexico's independence in 1821, tensions along the frontier escalated. Americans began settling on lands the Apache considered their own, while the Comanche expanded their raids further south and east. Amid this growing complexity, charismatic leaders emerged among the Apache, uniting scattered bands and renewing their fight. Though many of their names have been lost to history, their legacy of bravery and determination remains a vital part of Apache identity. The 1830s marked a shift in the balance of power across the plains and mountains. The United States, with its military strength and seemingly unlimited resources, began exerting increasing pressure on both tribes. The Comanche, though still powerful, faced growing difficulties due to the overhunting of buffalo, their primary resource. The Apache, meanwhile, continued their struggle for survival in an ever-hostile landscape. The resistance in the mountains became a symbol of Apache tenacity. Surrounded by enemies on all sides, they refused to surrender. Their deep knowledge of the land, combined with their ability to adapt to shifting circumstances, made them a formidable opponent. As the 19th century progressed, both the Apache and Comanche faced an unyielding enemy: American expansion. The arrival of settlers, the construction of railroads, and the mass slaughter of buffalo marked the beginning of the end for both nations. The Comanche, whose power had been built on controlling the plains and buffalo hunting, saw their way of life crumble as settlers decimated the herds. Meanwhile, the Apache, isolated in the mountains, resisted as best they could, but their position became increasingly precarious. Conflicts with the United States reached a critical point in the 1860s and 1870s. The Comanche, led by figures like Quanah Parker, fought to maintain their independence, but the U.S. military, equipped with superior technology and relentless strategies, ultimately overpowered them. By 1875, the Comanche surrendered and were confined to reservations in Oklahoma. The era of the Riders of Terror had come to an end. The Apache, however, continued their fight for years. Legendary leaders like Geronimo led fierce resistance against both U.S. and Mexican troops, launching raids from the Sierra Madre Mountains. Yet, the combined pressure from both nations became too great. In 1886, Geronimo surrendered, marking the end of the Apache armed resistance. Despite military defeat, the spirit of both nations was never destroyed. The legacy of the Apache and Comanche lives on in their stories of bravery, their culture, and their deep influence on the American Southwest. Today, Native American reservations stand as a testament to their resilience and their ongoing fight to preserve their identity despite centuries of adversity. The war between the Apache and Comanche and their struggles against colonizers was not just a battle for land or resources, it was a fight for survival and dignity. Though the weapons have long fallen silent, their history remains alive, reminding us of the complexity and tragedy of an era that shaped the destiny of an entire region.